Good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Hamsa Shrikant and I'm one of the 2 Athenaeum Fellows this year. In 1970, IVF became viable as a treatment for infertility, and the media was ablaze with references to Frankenstein trying to play God. In 2001, the former President Bush imposed drastic restrictions on stem cell research, which many critics felt was, quote, Franken science. In 2017, I was browsing Reddit when I chanced upon a video titled Frankenstein Cat. It featured 5 minutes of a cat doing literally nothing until it screams, stands up on 2 hind legs, and walks towards the camera with its paws pointing forward. It's alive. It is clear that the prefix Frankenstein or Franken thrives as a byword for any skepticism about cats, science, and technology. Over the years, it has frequently been referenced as a cautionary tale against atomic bombs, genetically modified crops, stem cell research, and artificial intelligence. Our speaker tonight, Jerrold Hogle, will discuss how Mary Shelley's famous novel has been immortalized by our anxieties about the modern world. Professor Hogle won the Howard Mumford Jones Thesis Prize at Harvard University, from where he received his PhD. After teaching in the English department at the University of Arizona for 44 years, he is now Professor Emeritus and University Distinguished Professor at Arizona. The winner of Guggenheim, Mellon, and other fellowships for research, including the Distinguished Scholar Award of the Keats Shelley Association of America, he has published extensively on English Romantic literature, literary and cultural theory, and the many different forms of Gothic. His books include, among others, Shelley's Process, The Undergrounds of the Phantom of the Opera, The Cambridge Companion to the Gothic Fiction, and The Cambridge Companion to the Modern Gothic. Currently, Professor Hogle is a reader at the Huntington Library in Pasadena and just completed co-chairing a conference on the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Professor Hogle's Athenaeum talk is co-sponsored by the Gould Center for Humanistic Studies at CMC. As always, I must remind you that audiovisual recording is strictly prohibited. The Athenaeum is a community and gathering space, and the use of cell phone greatly diminishes the experience for others. Please use this opportunity to put away your devices and adjust your seat if you have not already done so. And without further delay, please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Professor Jerrold E. Hogle.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. First of all, I want to thank all the people who have helped to bring me here. John Farrell, Priya Junar, the wonderful students we have here, our 2 Athenaeum Fellows, Samsa and Bruno, and the whole Athenaeum organization. I'm just so impressed with this program, this whole outfit, and I feel privileged to be one of the speakers in this array of very impressive people that you have talking to students, faculty, and the public here this week. I see I'm sandwiched between yesterday an arch conservative and tomorrow a flaming liberal. And that's as it should be. The students get exposed to all these ideas. I'm going to be talking about a text which has been a subject of a lot of debate, but is really at the heart of it, I want to suggest, about unresolved debates, about issues deep in our culture that we have anxieties about because we can't resolve them. We are this year, as you've heard, celebrating the 200th anniversary of the original publication of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. There's its title page of the original edition right there. Written by Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, with a little editing by her husband, although most of it she rejected, actually. We now see that in the manuscript. And it was written at a time, the 18 teens, that was fraught. 2 big revolutions had occurred. There were suppressions of political dissent. The Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe until 1815. Some revolutions led to new outbursts of freedom. Others led to cruel repressions. And there was burgeoning sciences, burgeoning industry, the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution. It was the time of transition into what we think of now as modernity. And Frankenstein reacted to that by being a deeply symbolic portrait of what that felt like in a novel that really takes place at the end of the 18th century rather than 1818. And those anxieties are still with us. That's why we have the Frankenstein of Boris Karloff, who played the creature in 1931, 1935, and 1939 on film. And he conveys some of the same anxieties, except it was more now the anxiety of what it meant to be a product of the Industrial Revolution, as though you could have bolts in your neck and be directed from outside yourself. But she mentioned it in introducing me. Now we have the issue of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Are we right to pursue those things? Are we right to pursue stem cell research? Is that violating the laws of God? Is that creating life in a way that should not be created? Those anxieties are still with us, and they were all rising in powerful ways at the time Mary Shelley wrote this novel. And the reason it has lasted, and the reason it's so brilliant, is because it brought so many of those issues together at the same time. Now, I think Frankenstein was able to do this as a novel because it is eminently a Gothic novel. Some critics have claimed, it's got a Gothic facade, but it's really the first science fiction novel. Well, it is the first science fiction novel, but I think because it's highly, highly Gothic. And it was highly Gothic because, in part, of how it began. It began at this place, which you see in a 19th century rendering later, the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. In the summer of 1816, June to be more precise, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, having run off 2 years before with Percy Bysshe Shelley, they were in flight from creditors and others in England and came to Switzerland to stay near the Villa Diodati, which was occupied at that time by the notorious English gentleman poet Lord Byron, George Gordon Lord Byron, whose portrait you see in the middle there, painted as he was about 1815. And he hosted them generously. They were there at the Villa Diodati almost every day, and they had long talks about many subjects far into the evening. Part of the discussions concerned the issues of whether electricity could be used to generate life in a dead body. And they referred a lot, as Mary Shelley would later say, to the writings of Erasmus Darwin, such writings as Zoonomia that Erasmus Darwin published in 1794. Erasmus Darwin was Charles Darwin's grandfather. He had early ideas about evolution, and he advanced very radical scientific ideas, including electricity as the fluid of life, and was rumored to have actually reanimated a dead body with an electric charge, although actually it was someone else who did it. And this was discussed, but right after that, Byron turned the discussion towards his fascination with ghost stories. And he read several out loud to the assembled group, and they read separately and together several Gothic ghost stories. And at one point, in the middle of June, he challenged everyone there to write their own ghost story and see who could do the best. Some have said it was a bet. It really wasn't a bet so much as a kind of a gentleman's contest. And they all set to work a bit, but only 2 works really emerged full force from this over the years after 1816. One was Frankenstein, but the other was a novel by another attendee of those confabs. There he is there, Dr. John Polidori. He was Byron's personal physician, hired by Byron to take care of him, and believe me, it was a task. And he was very close to Byron. He felt Byron was his true patron. He was devoted to Byron until, at the end of that summer, Byron threw him over, dismissed him. And from then on, Polidori was dead set against Byron. So he made Byron the model for the character of his ghost story, which he published in 1819 called The Vampire. And he created there the first Gothic and aristocratic vampire, the ancestor of Dracula, in 1819. Dracula didn't come until 80 years later. And so Polidori knew that Byron had already written about the vampire. The vampire had not yet been admitted to Gothic literature. And Polidori took him there in The Vampire in 1819, published a little over a year after Frankenstein in 1818. So there was a Gothic atmosphere circulating already as Frankenstein began. And I think Frankenstein is especially Gothic because of exactly what they read at the Villa Diodati. Mary Shelley, as some of you know who have been studying the novel, wrote an introduction to the 1831 third edition of her text. And in that introduction, she recalls this time at the Villa Diodati, and she recalls what they read there. She mentions that they read a group of ghost stories, Gothic stories, under the title Phantasmagoriana. She doesn't use that word in her preface, but that was the title of it. And it was Phantasmagoriana, put together by a Frenchman, Jean-Benoit Arrier, out of a series of German ghost stories that had been translated into French in 1812. And a lot of these stories came to affect both Frankenstein and Polidori's The Vampire. The one that Mary Shelley particularly remembered the most, and what for her became the model of the kind of Gothic image that morphed into her creature, was in a story within the Phantasmagoriana that is best translated as The Family Portraits. And she remembered in her 1831 introduction that story this way. This is Mary Shelley. There was the tale of the sinful founder of his race, whose miserable doom it was to bestow the kiss of death on all the younger sons of his fated house, just when they reached the age of promise. His gigantic, shadowy form, clothed like the ghost in Hamlet in complete armor, but with the beaver up, was seen at midnight by the moon's fitful beams to advance slowly along the gloomy avenues. And given the title of the story, this is a figure, like Hamlet's ghost, who walks out of a portrait. A step was heard, the door of the chamber opened, and he advanced to the couch of the blooming youths, who from that hour withered like flowers snapped on a stalk. And that, according to her, was the first kind of model of a Frankensteinian-like creature. And indeed, at one point, the only time he uses the word in the novel, Victor, having seen the creature, just after hearing of the death of his little brother William, says, "Oh my God, he's a vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave to wreak destruction on all who are dear to me." So she is drawing directly from a very, very Gothic story that goes all the way back to the influence of Shakespeare. But that story also draws on what happens to be the first Gothic novel by Horace Walpole, whose picture you see there. It was called The Castle of Otranto. It was published in 1764, and it proved so popular that he published a second edition with a preface to that edition, in which he called it for the first time a Gothic story, and that's the first time a text in English was called a Gothic story. And he defined many of the conventions of the Gothic, including the figure who walks out of the portrait. One of the ghosts in the Castle of Otranto, which takes place in the late Middle Ages, is the ghost of the reigning prince's grandfather, who actually killed the original owner of the castle decades ago, feels guilty about it, and walks forth from his own portrait to indicate how restive he is. That's the model for the kind of Gothic image that Mary Shelley had in mind, as she says herself. Now, Horace Walpole's preface to that second edition, he says he is trying to create a new kind of romance, a romance that combines the old romance of supernatural powers and beliefs with the new romance of novelistic realism, like was happening with novelists like Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding in the middle of the 18th century. He wants to put those two traditions together and make them interact with each other. Well, they're conflicting, because the old tradition assumes a supernatural level that the new tradition denies. And Walpole sort of plays with that. his ghosts are not ghosts of actual people. They're ghosts of portraits or ghosts of statues. The body behind them is not there. So the old beliefs are sort of emptied out, and yet we have the vestiges of them. And they're pulling us back towards the past, while new ways of thinking in the Enlightenment are pulling us forward. And he declared that to be fundamentally what the first Gothic story was about, albeit in disguise. And that meant, as I've described it since, that the Gothic as a form is like that old Roman god, Janus, after which January is named, with two faces, a face looking towards the aging past and a face looking towards the beginning and youthful future. The Gothic is a Janus-faced genre, looking backwards and forwards at the same time. And Mary Shelley grasped that as she adapted Walpolian-like, Otranto-like images, like that ghost she described from the Phantasmagoriana, to the idea of the generation of life that was also being discussed at Diodati. And she makes Victor Frankenstein's creation of the creature Janus-faced. On the one hand, Victor Frankenstein is using some of the modern science known to Mary Shelley. A lot of what Victor's master, Master Waldman at the University of Ingolstadt, says is based on the writings of that man up there, one of the great chemical scientists of the time who created the first voltaic battery that you see at the top of that picture. So many of the interests of modern science were actually being, as they were actually being talked about, were there in Mary Shelley's thinking. And Victor states them verbally. But Victor is also attracted to the work of old alchemists. For those of you who've read the novel, he reads Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, Paracelsus, who wrote in the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th centuries about alchemical processes using supernatural means that in some cases actually created little living beings, homunculi, in laboratory-like beakers, as you see in this illustration from the early 19th century of what alchemy is at least imagined to have been like. And this was actually an interest of her father, William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, who actually wrote a book about alchemists and necromancers later and was fascinated with it. It was also a fascination of her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was famous or infamous for his chemical experiments at Oxford, where he blew up, basically, his rooms, although that's not the reason he was expelled. He was expelled because he wrote a treatise called The Necessity of Atheism, and the church-state separation hadn't happened yet, so he was out. But Mary Shelley is drawing on Percy Shelley's fascination with all of this, and the fascination both with alchemy that looks back to ancient medieval times and supernatural ingredients, and the new science of her own time, which is looking forward to what was supposedly empirically verifiable. So the Gothic, as a genre, is Janus-faced. It's looking backwards and forwards at the same time. And because she so well developed the Gothic, particularly under the encouragement of what happened at the Villa Diodati, Frankenstein is Janus-faced too. The creature is created both out of interest in alchemy and out of interest in modern science. And these are incompatible systems. So of course, the creature is a figure of shreds and patches. He doesn't really go together. And that's in part because the principles that created him don't go together. Now, one of the things I've discovered in analyzing this Gothic tradition that is so Janus-faced is that it allows characters and authors to perform a particular function, a particular symbolic function, which was highlighted by the French psychoanalytic critic Julia Kristeva in a book published in 1980 in French called Powers of Horror. And she uses the word abjection, but she uses it in the literal sense of throwing over abjection. And in the process of abjection, human beings are trying not to remember certain very basic things about themselves that are very mixed. The fact that at one point we were half inside and half outside our mothers, half dead and half alive. Anomalous, not self-consistent. Or, as she later said, the fact that we really come from a variety of backgrounds rather than a single one. sometimes mixed racial backgrounds that we want to deny. And she claims, and we see this a lot in Gothic novels, that for people to feel that they have a pure identity, an identity that's consistent within oneself, they throw over into some other place. They abject the multiplicities inside themselves, as though they are not there, but are over there in that other mixed, monstrous thing. And Gothic symbols, like ghosts and creatures, are places of abjection, where the creator, in this case Victor Frankenstein, as in this 20th century painting, throws over into an other his more primitive impulses, his contradictions, where he claims that those are completely over there in the monstrous creature and not in me at all. And what this means is that those things in our culture, which we are at odds with ourselves about, which we can't decide, unresolved ideologies that are looking backwards and forwards at the same time, can be abjected into these other monstrous figures and reflect back their complexity, and yet we can pretend that they don't belong to us, but they belong to something other and alien. And I think that's one of the great symbolic achievements of Gothic fiction and of Frankenstein. We could choose to ignore it. We can say, well, this is just a monster. But if we look closer at what the creature symbolizes, we realize that he symbolizes what Victor and others have abjected onto an other creature, as though it were not in them, even though it is, and is only over there. And therefore we choose to fear it, try to flee from it, even though in some ways we are fleeing from ourselves and aspects of our own societies. And what we're mainly... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I guess I'm too violent. Sorry, when I talk about the creature, I guess I get that way. But anyway, now I think that what Frankenstein is doing, like the rest of the Gothic does at its best, is to take issues of a particular time that are deep in the culture and that are conflicting, that are unresolved, Janus-faced, and projecting those over into the creature, and that's what we have anxiety about. That's what we really fear. Yes, we fear that the creature is artificial and natural at the same time. Yes, we fear that the creature is half dead and half alive. We fear those contradictions because they are symbolic of other contradictions in our thinking that are deep in our culture and deep in our psyches, and we want to confront and avoid at the same time. And Frankenstein allowed us to do that and dealt with anxieties that were at the very heart of the coming of modernity and have carried forward, sometimes through Gothic symbols, ever since. And so what I want to do in the rest of this talk is to talk about what those anxieties were. And these are all anxieties based on unresolved Janus-faced conflicts. And there were many of them. That's part of the genius of Frankenstein. She brought a great many together at this time of the coming of modernity, all at the same time in one symbolic place. I think that was partly because, despite the fact that she was 18, 19, she was hugely well read for someone of her age. She came from literary and philosophical parents and was steeped in the kinds of readings and debates that the novel is based on. And it alludes all over the place to ancient classics, to current science, to Gothic fiction, to Shakespearean theater, and many, many others. It's amazing how much she was able to put together. And what she did in the process was put together the unresolved conflicts at the heart of her culture that were the basis of the deepest cultural anxieties of her time. And one of them, as we've already started to allude to, was the conflict between older and sacred science, like the alchemists, and new or so-called real science. And she was well aware that as she was writing Frankenstein, there had been an ongoing debate over several years, which continued into the following year, between two professors in the London College of Surgeons, Dr. Joseph Abernethy and Dr. William Lawrence. The Shelleys were aware of this because William Lawrence was their personal physician while they were in England. So we're not talking about some distant knowledge here that they heard about in the newspapers. And both argued very different things about the nature of life, which was being hotly debated at the time. Abernethy argued that Life, so as not to violate Christian thinking, comes from beyond. It is a force that is infused into the fetus from outside, essentially from God. And we might call it electricity, we might call it something else, but that's where it comes from. William Lawrence said, no, it's a material process where the parts of a body coming together generate life out of other parts. It's the interplay of the pieces, the structural interaction of the parts of the body that produce life. And they had debates about this for years that were published in the press. Now, two of the scientists at the time, Erasmus Darwin and Sir Humphrey Davy, whom I mentioned before, the great chemist of the time, both tried to resolve these somewhat awkwardly in their writing. They tried to have it both ways, and you can sort of, and when you read them, you can sort of see the seams showing. And Mary understood the seams showing because these two writers, Abernethy and Lawrence, were so well known to her. And when Victor Frankenstein is narrating his story to Captain Walton and recalls his process of creating the creature, you can see this conflict between these two different philosophies, an unresolved conflict, coming out. He recalls, Victor does, I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness, a sudden light broke in upon me. So on the one hand, he sees this force, this light from outside, entering his mind and entering the body, as Abernethy would say. But he's discovered this in the process of examining all the minutiae of causation, the way in which William Lawrence would advocate. So the creature is a combination not just of alchemy and new science. The creature is also a combination of Abernethy's vision and Lawrence's vision, and they're incompatible. There's a struggle there. And the whole society was struggling with this debate. What is really the nature of life? And that struggle and the fears that came up from that struggle, what will it mean, are abjected into Frankenstein the novel and Frankenstein's creature. There's another conflict that was so abjected into the creature. When the creature first comes into existence, and he later gets to tell this story to Victor Frankenstein, when the creature comes into existence, he struggles, of course, to perceive things. And gradually, he finds his way out of the city where Victor abandoned him into the countryside. And eventually, he says, in recalling this to Victor later, after he's learned language, I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. Now, of course, one of the things he's doing is discovering fire for the first time, sort of repeating primitive actions in a very rapid succession. But every reader at that time would have recognized him as thereby representing a well-known population, the new kind of homeless in England, that had been let loose from the old aristocratic estates and were being pushed towards the cities to be a part of the industrial labor force, the new working poor. That map up there is a map that shows how old estates were enclosed in new structures that forced all the tenant farmers off of them so that they could no longer make a living that way and had to move to the city. But as they moved to the city, they discovered that many of the industries they were going to be a part of were being taken over by machines that could do the job of human beings. So there was a strike, as this newspaper cartoon represents, in 1812, where the laborers tried to break apart the machines that were taking their livelihood away from them. The creature embodies all of that. He is the working class as it is created by the middle class to be useful to it. And then the middle class fears what it has created. So the working class is a benefit to the middle class, and at the same time, it's a fearful object of otherness. And as the century wore on, the Frankenstein creature became more and more associated with it. When workers rebelled in Ireland, as they frequently did, against English rule. Again and again, not just once, the Irish poor were characterized as the Irish Frankenstein, as in this 1882 Punch London cartoon, The Irish Frankenstein. He is the working class rising up against the master who created them, who brought them to life. And one could argue that Mary Shelley herself was ambivalent about people of this class. On the one hand, she sympathized with how horribly they'd been treated and how they are forced into violent reactions because of violent actions against them. At the same time, she was afraid of the violence that would eventually erupt if, in fact, these workers revolted in some way other than a kind of passive resistance. So she felt that ambivalence herself, and that ambivalence is deep, deep, deep in the novel, and it's abjected into the creature as one of the Janus-faced anxieties that he represents and conveys. Then another anxiety, very natural in some ways for Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, was the status of women. As many of you know, Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, perhaps the most noted feminist of her time. Mary Wollstonecraft died in 1797, weeks after giving birth to Mary Shelley, her namesake. And Mary always blamed herself for her mother's death. She sometimes thought of herself as like the creature, because in a way she killed her own mother. But she also valued her mother's ideas. And her mother wrote a very famous treatise called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman that was published in 1792 to say women ought to have not only equal opportunity, but equal education with men. And that men should not make women subservient to them, but relate to them in a relationship of genuine intellectual equality. And this had support in other quarters too, but she was writing it against a very famous writer, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French writer who had written a treatise on education called Émile in 1762, which became very quickly translated into English. And he advocated for a new kind of education that was more natural and productive and proceeded with the natural growth of a child. But he said the education for men should be much different than the education for women. And so he gave Émile a girlfriend called Sophie, and exemplifies a very different education from her. Mary Wollstonecraft wasn't having it. She said the education should be equal. And she outlined her vision of women's greater intellectual equality in The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, where she also felt that women should be able to have equal property rights with men too. Right now, women lost their property altogether when they married a man. And they had no rights, independent rights, once they were married to a man who could do anything with her that he wanted. And she exemplifies that in a novel she left incomplete when she died in 1797, and it was published by her husband, called The Wrongs of Woman, Mary or the Wrongs of Woman. There, she shows a woman who is forced into an asylum because her husband wants her there because she's resisting his overpowering claims. And she meets a woman there, Jemima, of a lower working class who has had even worse experiences at the hand of men and at the hands of the upper classes. And Mary Shelley remembers all of this in Frankenstein. Now you'd have to say, well, where is woman in Frankenstein? Well, that's part of the problem, right? Victor creates a creature without the benefit of woman. Woman is not there. And it's sort of like the kinds of treatises that were being written at the time, showing how to deliver a baby at birth with forceps and such. This was typical of the kind of description of how to bring a baby to birth that you would see in the early 19th century in English treatises. There's the baby, there's the instruments, where's the woman? It's as though a birth could be created without woman being present at all, and so Mary Shelley takes that in her first science fiction novel one step further. And so she's talking about the leaving out of women from education, from science, and what that might mean. But it also has other effects in Frankenstein. You remember Justine Moritz, the au pair, who comes to work for the Frankenstein family and who becomes the au pair to the little boy William. When William is killed, it turns out by the creature, and his locket is left with the sleeping Justine. Justine is accused of his murder, and she's eventually convicted quickly and hung. Why? Because she was a woman of a certain class. And why wouldn't a woman of a certain class do those things? She's rushed to judgment. And Victor, of course, can't say who killed her because no one would believe him. And he's afraid to admit his association with the creature. I'm sorry. So we see this illustration of Justine being hung, but there's a little ray of hope in the story because there is that character, Safi, the Arabian woman, who comes into the life of the Diodati family that the creature overhears in the forest. Safi is educated by the Diodati's into Western ways and into French. And as he overhears that, the creature gets educated too in much of the reading and in much of the language that she learns. She becomes a figure in answer to Rousseau's Sophie of the possibility of what education of women can produce and how it can even welcome women from outside the Western world through the possibility of education. So she offers us both the negative and the positive sides of the future status of women and brings forward the anxiety that existed at the time about what the status of woman should be. If woman oversteps her boundaries, will she not become monstrous? That's certainly what Victor Frankenstein fears when he sets out to create a female creature at the creature's request and can't do it. He can't do it because it would mean bringing a woman who is that kind of equal into the world, and that's one of his many mistakes. So the status of women, deep into Frankenstein, throughout it, abjected there in all kinds of ways. But then there is the educational struggle that we still have between nature versus nurture. Rousseau and Wollstonecraft both agreed, at least, that there should be a new kind of education for as many human beings as possible that would transform the class structure utterly if it occurred. And William Godwin, who married Mary Wollstonecraft and was Mary Shelley's father, agreed in a treatise published in 1793 called An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, which is about the expansion of education across the entire population and the doing away of the class structure in the process over time. Very idealistic, but very, very compelling as you read it. And this hope is there. That's why education is so important in Frankenstein. How Victor is educated, how the creature is educated, has a great deal to do with what with what either of them is. And the idea is that if you're educated badly or only partially educated and then terribly mistreated, you will become vicious or self-protective or something other than what you should be. And she's taking the lessons of Rousseau, her mother, and her father to heart. Rousseau and Emile even proposed the idea. Suppose we take a fully grown person without any education and educate them from that point on. So he came up with the idea of the creature in a way. But when Mary carries it out, she's carrying out this whole heritage, but it's the anxiety over it. How much does nurture, the way someone is educated, make them what they are? Well, for Godwin and Wollstonecraft, it was almost 80-90%. But at times, the creature notes tendencies in him to anger, to violence, that can't be explained entirely by his treatment. And Victor notices them too, and so there comes to be a conflict between how much is nature and how much is nurture in the education of a human being. And the creature is the abjection of the irresolution between those two contending forces. At the same time, there is a contention between the conscious self and the unconscious self. There were starting to be theories at the time that even though the mind could be educated by learning things over time, there was a whole unconscious dimension that education couldn't affect. And it started coming out in etchings like this one by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya in 1799. The sleep of reason produces monsters. That there was a monstrous level within us that we could not control and could arise at any point. And one of the Gothic texts that was read aloud by Byron at the Villa Diodati was by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who you see there in the middle. And it was a Gothic text in poetry called Christabel, about a young woman who invites a beautiful statuesque version of herself that she suddenly meets in the forest as though she had magically appeared, invites her into her room, into her bed, in a kind of a quasi-lesbian relationship. And the next morning, Christabel awakens, as in this late 19th century illustration, and sees Geraldine dressing, and sees a viperous shape down her side. She is in fact a vampire. And Christabel feels enervated, and Geraldine's breasts are engorged. And it turns out that not only is she a vampire, but she carries through a lot of the things that Christabel would like to do, but doesn't dare to do. She becomes an extension of Christabel's unconscious desires. And that text was written right before Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein, and it appears in Frankenstein itself. The creature is a double for Frankenstein, among other things. He carries out the unconscious impulses of Frankenstein. He kills his fiancée, Elizabeth. Why? Because Elizabeth had killed his mother. If you've read the novel, Elizabeth gave a disease to Frankenstein's mother that killed her. And unconsciously, Frankenstein wants revenge. Frankenstein wants to kill that little brother that gets all that attention. He wants to kill his best friend, who is admired by everyone, while Frankenstein is thought of as something of an oddball. So that's why Victor says he was a vampire let loose from the grave, carrying out destruction against all of those I love. My own spirit, he says, let loose from the grave. At times, he realizes it. So that's why in this illustration of 1831 by Theodor von Holst, that even though Victor is recoiling from his creature in this frontispiece, their faces look almost exactly the same. The creature is a double for the other. And a final anxiety. When the creature is actually produced and we first see him, he looks a particular way. And this is the only attempt by a 20th century artist to render him exactly as he's rendered in the novel. This is how Victor recalls him. His yellow skin scarcely covered the works of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But those luxuriancies only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The creature is multiracial. Victor has set out to create a symbol of a new unified humanity, and of course what he creates out of a bunch of separate dead bodies is a multiracial creature, and that's part of the horror. He's not consistently anything. And the creature recognizes that when he reads about the other races after overhearing the de Lacys read this book, The Ruins of Empires by the Comte de Volney, where he describes the different races of the earth and gives them psychological characteristics. He speaks of the slothful Asiatics, for example, as opposed to the energetic white Grecians. And the creature accepts that, and he therefore accepts his own racial inferiority. And Sir William Lawrence, the same one that that was Shelley's personal physician, had written a classification of the races, the yellow Mongoloids, the black Ethiopians, the white Caucasians, and others, and he flatly said the white Caucasians were superior to the others. And so when Victor confronts this creature, he's confronted with the fact that humanity is actually a racial multiplicity. And people want to suppress that in order to have a kind of racial purity in their identities. Now, you can say, well, these were all deep-seated conflicts at the time of Frankenstein. Where are they now? They're still with us. Don't you recognize them all? The problem of racial otherness. We want to have a unified humanity, but of course, there's all this sense that those of other races should be kept out of, oh my God, the United States, as though immigration that made us great won't make us great anymore. How are the things that we make nowadays caused by unconscious as opposed to conscious causes? How are we raised today? What makes a person? Is it nature versus nurture? We've changed the balance. Now the genome tells us all kinds of things that are nature rather than nurture. Where does one stop and another begin? We're anxious about that. The status of women. People used to say, well, we've resolved that. Witness what's happening right now as we speak. And the difference in the economies. Now we're not moving from an agricultural to an industrial economy. We're moving from a post-industrial to an information-based economy. And oh, is it scary. We still think that some kinds of science, say like stem cell research or artificial intelligence or genetic engineering, may be against the laws of nature and the laws of God, or maybe they're furthering them. Which are they? We're anxious about all of that. All of those anxieties that we saw in Frankenstein and that are abjected into the creature in the novel are still with us today in slightly changed forms, but in powerful ways. There are more that I could describe to you in Frankenstein. She brings so much together, but I hope you get the idea that Frankenstein is a place where the anxieties of modernity, based in irresolvable conflicts at the heart of ourselves, are deeply symbolized in ways we still recognize. And that explains why we still read Frankenstein, and it also explains why we keep adapting Frankenstein to deal with these issues that are still with us. Thank you.
All right, we'll now have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and stand up when you speak, and do try to keep them brief. Priority will go to students, as always.
Students first. Yes.
In your personal opinion, when do you think it becomes kind of inhumane for humans to kind of overstep in terms of going to like science research? When is it like, what's the limit? What's the boundary?
Yeah. I think it's a very delicate point. You're talking about my personal opinion. I mean, you know, I'll give you two answers to that. One has to do with the question of responsibility. If you are creating something like that, what are you willing to take responsibility for? The problem with Victor Frankenstein is that he doesn't take responsibility for his creature. And so the creature suffers the consequences of not being protected and properly educated. So the issue is responsibility. If we're going to create artificial intelligence, how much responsibility are we going to take for managing it ourselves so that it doesn't acquire such an independent life that it becomes destructive? But also, are we willing to, as nations, come together to draw certain lines between how far we go with things? I heard a talk at this conference I co-chaired by Jennifer Doudna, who is the head of the laboratory at UC Berkeley who discovered CRISPR-Cas9, which is a process that you can inject into a fetus, and change its DNA. Now that's possible. And so do with that? You know, do we have designer babies where you can order up what you want? She says no, but how do you stop that? And maybe that's an extension of the question of responsibility. You can save people from diseases by having CRISPR-Cas9, but you can also create the possibility of designer babies. Well, can we choose as a society to say no? We will stop at that point. We can, but it's very difficult to do, especially when it's financially attractive. So I guess the issue comes down to a question of responsibility. Sorry about that. Other questions? Very good one.
If Gothic fiction is by nature, by two-faced or Janus-faced. Why do you think Frankenstein is the one that we always use to talk about conflicting natures and
Yeah.
stuff like that?
Well, she's asking, there have been a lot of Gothic fictions, and there have been a lot of Gothic fictions in which you have symbolic creatures of one sort or another into which things are abjected. I mean, you can talk about Dracula that way. I've talked about the Phantom of the Opera that way. You can talk about Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll's Mr. Hyde that way. But I think Frankenstein has the most lasting power because it's struck at the very heart of the issues that make the modern world the modern world. The transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy, the transition from religion-based culture to a science and technology-based culture. I mean, those are really at the heart of what made the modern world. And because Mary Shelley was able to symbolize that in such a visual way, it stays with us because it's so much a part of us. We worry about all the issues at the heart of our civilization that Frankenstein demonstrated and continues to demonstrate. The others have been adapted, but not like Frankenstein. Frankenstein gets adapted year after year after year after year. And interestingly, as we've had some of these issues come back to the fore, there have been more adaptations of Frankenstein. One of which I strongly recommend, which wasn't seen by very many people, was a 2015 film made by Bernard Rose. He wrote and directed it. It's called Frankenstein. And it's about a scientist who creates a creature in a laboratory near LA using a 3D printer. And the chemical composition wasn't quite well worked out. So when the creature comes out, he's gorgeous. I mean, they really cast a superbly handsome young actor. But the chemicals begin to deteriorate, and there suddenly start to be splotches and pimples and cracks. And he starts to remind people of the AIDS epidemic. And so he's cast out into the street, and he literally becomes a part of the homeless population of Los Angeles. So right there, these modern issues, and of course all of those were there in Frankenstein. The creature is homeless. The creature is cracked in a mixture of incompatible parts. All of that was there, and yet now, all the things we see were happening right now were there in Frankenstein. I think it's because it symbolizes so much a part of what the modern world is based on and what we're anxious about in it.
Good evening. I'm very fascinated by what you brought up about the idea that the creature is fulfilling Victor's subconscious desires, that he has these subconscious hatreds of his wife or his family. And I didn't know if you could continue that idea. How do you think that applies to Justine? As she's kind of a collateral death, not a direct murder.
She is a collateral death. One passage I didn't get to read is kind of indicative of what's going on here. After the creature creates, Victor creates his creature and sees him and recoils from him, he runs from him, but he's so exhausted that he falls into a swoon, into a sleep, and he dreams. I slept indeed, he recalls, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, his fiancée. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling on the folds of the flannel. And then I awoke and beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. So that dream dissolves into the face of the creature. The creature embodies what that unconscious dream is suggesting. What Victor wants is to get back to his dead mother, even through Elizabeth. He pushes her aside and embraces his dead mother. And of course, we know from the rest of the story that Elizabeth gave the disease to the mother that killed her earlier in the story. And he does say later, when he sees the creature outlined against the lightning flashing sky, just after hearing of his brother William's death, he realizes all at once that the creature killed William. Now, how would he know that if it wasn't already in him? He immediately recognizes it, that the creature, and he says, by God, I am the author of this. So on some level, he admits that his unconscious drives, which he wants to suppress, of course, are coming out again and again and again. And it all goes back to the desire to reunite with the dead mother and to push out everything else that is in its way. And Freud later made much of that in his theories of the unconscious in the 1890s, saying that he was partly influenced by earlier literature. So there's just too much evidence in the novel, and by Victor's own admission. I mean, at one time he calls himself the murderer of Justine, of Clerval, of William, because the creature he created did it, and the creature is an extension of his own desires. Now, yes, Justine is collateral damage, but Justine also embodies the condition of the working woman who is suspected of things that she's not guilty of. And Mary Shelley is embodying that condition of woman in her and the way that she is treated and abjecting that part. I don't think that part is so much an extension of Victor's unconscious. It's an extension of Mary Shelley's carrying through of her mother's realizations. That help? Yeah. Yes?
Do you think if some of the issues that you talked about, the Janus-faced issues in Frankenstein, are solved or addressed as a society, it'll become less relevant? Or do you think Frankenstein could be interpreted in other ways? Or do you think those issues are fundamentally unsolvable as a society?
No, I don't think they're fundamentally unsolvable, and I'm not sure that Mary Shelley did either. But she thought, I mean, her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, was much more of an idealist. He thought if human beings fundamentally change their perceptions, since all things exist as they are perceived, everything will change. She didn't have that much confidence in human nature. But she hoped with her father and her mother that a gradual transformation of universal education would change the class structure to the point where there wouldn't be working classes of quite this kind. She couldn't exactly envision how that would happen, but she hoped for it, just as her father and her mother had. So there was this hope of a positive change in the makeup of humanity that would come from a universalization of education. And I think she also hoped for an end to the othering of human beings because of race. There is hope offered there in the character of Sapphi, who comes from Arabia, is educated by the de Lacy family, marries Felix de Lacy. Now, granted, she's forced to flee. We don't know what happens to her. Her fate is up in the air, but that's sort of what Mary Shelley wanted to say. The fate of women like this is up in the air. The fate of the unity of the races is up in the air. The fate of the education of women is up in the air. But that doesn't mean that we can't do better with all of them.
Going back to your conscious versus subconscious
Yes.
point, do you think that we're aware of our subconscious, or do you, because in the novel, Victor Frankenstein was talking about how much he loved Elizabeth and Clerval and all those characters. Do you think that he was aware?
Not all the time, no.
Okay.
No, we're not. I mean, the very definition of our unconscious, as Freud went on to talk about it and others have, is that we are not aware of it. It exists at a much deeper and more visceral and primal level. It goes back to certain infantile drives, the desire to get to the mother's breast, for example. And if anything comes between that, we have to get it out of the way. So that's why I think it's useful symbolically that the creature is created as a child, a big child, like Rousseau proposed, because he has all those childish impulses. And it's the childish impulses that come out from Victor after he's repressed them for many years. And most of the time, we're not conscious of that. But I still say again, it's in the text, because Victor admits, I am the murderer of Clerval. I am the murderer of William. I am the murderer of Justine. Now, he never says, I am the murderer of Elizabeth, but Elizabeth is strangled by the creature, because Victor refuses finally to create a female creature for her. And that's because he can't confront dealing with the female body. He can't. because that's what he wants the most, to be reunited with his mother. And he can't confront that consciously because it's an unconscious thing that he's afraid of and wants at the same time. That's part of the unconscious. It's things we want, but we shouldn't want. And so we're afraid of rising up within us at the same time. That help?
Thank you. So I have a question. You've spoken a bit about this with respect to the female companion for Frankenstein's monster, but could you sort of go into more about how we can understand the lack of strong female characters in the novel, especially given the fact that Mary Shelley was, the daughter of a feminist and a feminist herself?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that, on the face of it, she was worried about the fact that women were being completely left out of science. Okay? They weren't allowed to have any kind of a scientific education or to work in laboratories. So if women are going to be left out of science, what is going to be the result? And of course, science was putting up those pictures of how to birth babies, leaving out the woman in the picture altogether. So she was worried about the fact that without an equal education, without equal opportunity, women would be left out of educational and scientific endeavors. And to her, that's a detriment to civilization. To deny, half the population a role in the advancement of the world. So she's making a point by leaving the woman out. And women still, remember, have very powerful moments. I mean, when he has that dream, it turns out that the face of the creature is really born from his desire to get back to his mother. And that's the one thing he leaves out in the creation of her. So she's trying to make a point about what the leaving out of women might actually mean, and what rushing to assumptions about women, like Justine, how destructive that can be. And she has Elizabeth go on about the injustice of Justine again and again and again. And that's her mother crying out through Mary Shelley. Now, in later novels, she gives women much more prominent roles. So it's not as though she was against women in fiction. She wanted to make a point about what happens when women are left out of the essential processes of life.
Thank you.
All right, I'm actually going to ask a question too, and it's about a part of the talk that it looked like you didn't have time to get to for, I don't know how many people saw, but there was a seventh anxiety that was briefly flashed before you went back to the sixth.
Yes.
It was about climate change, or I
Yes.
think that,
Yes.
I wanted to know a bit more about that.
Okay. Well, I tried to get this to about 45 minutes, but I realized I was falling a little short, and I wanted to obey. You said you got to finish in 45 minutes, and I did. So I left one of the anxieties out, and it's a very current one, climate change. And it turns out that climate change plays a big part in Frankenstein. Let's begin with the fact that when Mary Shelley started to write Frankenstein, she starts with Frankenstein's own story. That whole frame in the novel about him meeting Captain Walton in the Arctic was not there. She added it in 1817. Now, one reason for that was that she wanted to universalize the theme. It's not just quests to create new life that can risk leaving people behind. It's quests like that to conquer the world outside and leave domestic life abandoned. She wanted to universalize the theme. But as she did that, she enlisted something that was very much in the news. Voyages to the Arctic were going on all the time, and she was reading about them in the morning newspapers that got sent to them. And why were they going on with such urgency? Why was the government starting to fund more of them? Well, it turned out that the summer of 1816, when this was started, was the coldest summer on record. There were storms, the kind of weather that you see in Frankenstein. That was the weather in the middle of Europe in 1816. And there was a fear that the earth was turning cold, permanently cold. Now, the reality was that an eruption had occurred back in 1815, all the way over in what is now Indonesia. Mount Tambora erupted and sent a huge cloud across first North America and then Europe. And it reached the center of Europe by 1816, the summer of 1816, when Mary Shelley was writing the novel. Now, the press started to debate what should we do, because the fear was that ice flows were coming down from the north and cooling the planet. So we had to send voyages to the north to find out how those could be broken up. And there were some people who believed that if you got beyond the ice flows, you would find a warm center. And if you broke up the ice flows, the warmth could be redistributed across the Earth. There was actually that belief at that time. And there were Arctic voyages that were funded in order to achieve that sense. And Captain Walton, at the beginning of the novel, imagines just a warm center at the North Pole. So these were things that were going on at the time, and there were debates about how to deal with climate change when there was a possibility that the Earth was getting permanently colder. Now, of course, it had more immediate effects than we've sometimes seen with climate change now. You know, there were massive crop failures, large branches of the population in parts of the Earth had died out. There was not a lot of trouble getting people to accept the fact that something was wrong. But they didn't have the kind of knowledge, no TV, right? and newspaper reporters couldn't possibly think that this coldness at the center of Europe was caused by an eruption from Mount Tambora over in Indonesia a year ago. So they couldn't understand it, and they came up with all kind of speculative things. And voyages to the north to solve this problem, to solve the problem of climate change, was one of the big things in the news. And she latched onto it, because this voyage towards some, you know, absolute betterment is like Victor's voyage. It was analogous, Walton and Victor. And, you know, the Charles Robinson's account at the end of the Penguin edition that some of you have is exactly right. All of the characters in the novel are in some ways extensions of Victor Frankenstein. Not just the creature, most of all, but Captain Walton is a version of Frankenstein himself. And the kind of aspiration that Frankenstein embodies can be both constructive and destructive. And that's true of Captain Walton too, and it may be true of some of the radical efforts to affect climate change at the time. Any more?
Hi. You mentioned the recent film in 2015, but I was wondering if you could speak to any other contemporary adaptations.
Oh. Well, there have been many. Some are better than others. I mean, some just take pieces of the Frankenstein myth and don't make much of its symbolic elements. I mean, there's a movie that I didn't like very much called I, Frankenstein, where you know, a creature like that is kind of made to become a kind of superhero, you know, saving the world in a dark disguise. You know, why call it Frankenstein if you're getting that far from the story? But one adaptation I did like very much, which some of you may have seen in the circulation of it through a program called National Theatre Live. These are filmed versions of stage plays staged in England by the National Theatre of Great Britain that you can go and see in theaters at only at particular times. And the National Theatre in 2011 did a great adaptation, theatrically brilliant adaptation of Frankenstein with Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller. And if you want to see a great adaptation of Frankenstein, mind you, it takes liberties with the novel, as all of them do, see that one. It was great, theatrically, brilliantly conceived, and of course there was theatrical brilliance added by the fact that Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller switched roles night after night. So you can see one where Cumberbatch is the creature and Johnny Lee Miller is Frankenstein, and the opposite of that the next night. And of course that develops the fact that the two are doubles of each other. And so I think that was done very effectively in that adaptation. So that's the one I would recommend the most. But I do also recommend that 2015 Bernard Rose Frankenstein, where he becomes a part of the homeless population. I mean, it's very touching, very compelling. And it tries to stay close to the novel. The whole narrative voice is words right out of the novel about the creature's experience, and he's translating it into right now in both the scientific and the social issues. Other questions?
Hi, so I have a question for you about genre. So you very usefully analyzed Frankenstein for us in terms of the Gothic.
Yes.
And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how some scholars prefer to identify Frankenstein as the first science fiction novel. So
Yeah.
we're going to analyze it differently if we're considering it in terms of its Gothic or its sci-fi roots. And so my bigger question for you, though, is what role does genre play for you in literary analysis? Why is it important to identify something
Well,
generically?
yeah, genre, this is from a very good literary scholar here. She knows what she's talking about. The genre, the type of work that a work starts out being, affects a lot of what's there in it, because the author is trying to fulfill certain tendencies in an existing mode of writing. And Mary Shelley was clearly trying to carry out some of the features of the Gothic. But she was also trying to incorporate into the Gothic the issues in science and technology of her own time. And she tried to combine the two. And my view is, if you're going to talk about Frankenstein, talk about it in terms of the Gothic that led to the creation of science fiction. Don't separate the two genres. Because it's the Gothic that makes her symbolization of the scientific debates possible. So to separate the Gothic from science fiction. Now, it turns out a lot of later science fiction has an awful lot of Gothic elements to it. And other kinds of science fiction don't. It eventually separated itself in some forms from the Gothic, and you have to talk about it as doing that when it does. But just like there's a problem with seeing the creature as something pure and individual when in fact he's a mixture of things, so it's wrong to try and pin great work down to just one genre. Because really great work, powerful work, combines genres. And the Gothic in itself is really a combination of genres, old romance and new novel. So it's really a pastiche, a hybrid. And so Mary Shelley used a hybrid to create a further hybrid, science fiction coming out of the Gothic. And I like to see, in films and so on, when they take things from several genres, even though they try to make one dominate it. Help?
Okay, that is all the time that we have for questions, but please join me in thanking Professor Hogle.